We have made it to the third branch of our federal government. We're going to look at the judicial branch, and this video will just be an overview of the branch, and then we will have some more videos that dive deeper into specific topics. But we want you to know overall what this branch is, because it's probably the one that is least reported on. It's the one least in the news, unless there is a nominee for a seat on the Supreme Court or something like that. Most of the time, the judicial branch is not as prominent in the news as the president or Congress is. So what is the judicial branch? It's the third and final branch created in the U.S. Constitution, created in Article 3. And this branch contains the court system of the United States. The main role of the judicial branch is to interpret law. If you remember, the legislative branch makes laws, the executive branch enforces those laws, and then we have a judicial branch that interprets those laws to decide what they mean and how they should be applied, and how that may change over time. We should always go back to the source, so we're going to look at the actual quote from Article 3 of the Constitution, which created the judicial branch. This is Section 1 of Article 3, and you can see that it mentions that the judicial power of the U.S. shall be vested in one Supreme Court and other lower courts that Congress can create. So Congress creates everything but the Supreme Court. And that they shall hold those offices during good behavior. We'll talk about a little bit later about how judges get to be judges in the federal court system, and also how long they serve. But that's established in Article 3 of the Constitution. And just always remember, we need to go back to the Constitution to see where these powers come from, because that is the source of our government's power. There is a dual court system in the United States. We are not going to talk a lot about state courts in this video, and in this semester we're mostly looking at the federal level. So we're mostly looking at that left side, which is shorter, the U.S. District Courts, the U.S. Courts of Appeals, and then ultimately the U.S. Supreme Court. But just know that if there is a state a case that breaks state law, that can work its way up to the United States Supreme Court, and that's seen over on the right-hand side of this diagram. A trial could start in a state court, work its way up, and if somebody feels like their rights have been violated or a court case was ruled the wrong way, they could appeal that decision up to a higher level of court, and eventually that can make it to the U.S. Supreme Court. So just know that the U.S. Supreme Court sits at the top of both of these court systems, both the state and the federal. So how do we choose these judges who become federal court judges or even Supreme Court justices? It's part of the checks and balances system that we have discussed many times throughout this semester, and there is a checks and balances video you can check out on our YouTube channel if you want to learn more about that overall process. But this specifically starts with the president, who is the head of the executive branch, appointing someone who they want to be a federal judge or Supreme Court justice. But that person does not instantly just to become that judge. That would be way too much power for the president, and would basically mean the judicial branch was also ran by the president, because if the president could pick judges whoever they wanted, that would probably give them too much power. So that has to go to the Senate. So the Senate is part of the legislative branch. The Senate basically gives the nominee a job interview. The senators will meet with this candidate and try to learn more about how they think they would handle the job of a federal judge or Supreme Court justice, and then they would vote. The Senate has to approve that nominee for them to get the job. If the Senate does not approve them, then the person does not get to be a judge or a Supreme Court justice. It now takes 51 votes in the Senate to approve a nominee. It used to take 60, so you used to have both parties kind of in agreement somewhat. You had to have votes from both political parties typically for the nominee to be approved, but that process has changed over time as the political parties don't really work with each other a ton and may block nominees altogether. So that process was changed over the past decade or so to that only needing 51 votes. So whoever has the majority in the Senate tends to have that control over who becomes a judge or a Supreme Court justice. Once that judge is chosen, they do get to serve for life. That's that whole part of Article 3 that talks about serving in good behavior. A person can choose to retire, or obviously if they pass away, they would lose their position, but otherwise they're not running for elections, or they don't have to be renominated. They can really only be removed by impeachment, and that's if they do something really, really bad. Most of the time they serve for life. This is the longer diagram of the steps involved, but just essentially know that it involves the president nominating someone, and then the Senate has to approve that person. What do these judges do? This is a current, as of 2018, picture of the Supreme Court, with the newest justices being the two men in the back row, Neil Gorsuch on the left and Brett Kavanaugh on the right. Those are the two most recent appointees to the Supreme Court. So there's 9 justices most of the time. Federal judges. So these are in the federal courts below the Supreme Court. They do a couple different things. If it's just the U.S. district courts, they hear federal criminal cases and federal civil cases at the federal level. So a federal crime could be something like robbing a bank. That's a federal crime. Domestic terrorism would be a federal crime. Those cases would go to federal courts. Most cases are not federal cases, but there are still a lot of them. It's a big country. And so at that first level, they just hear the case and decide, did someone break this law, guilty or innocent? Then beyond that, if that case gets appealed to a higher level, then there are U.S. District Courts of Appeals. An appeal is when you think the judge ruled incorrectly, or I was found guilty incorrectly. I want to challenge this ruling, saying they violated my rights, or something didn't go correctly, and I think maybe it wasn't constitutional what was done, or my rights were violated under what the Constitution currently says. Whatever the reason, you may appeal that case. If you lose, up to a higher appellate court. If you again feel like you were wronged, or maybe you win at the appellate level, but then the other side appeals that ruling, that could go to the Supreme Court then. So the Supreme Court justices they're going to hear those appeals from lower courts, either from the states or from the federal court system, and they're going to give basically a final say on was this case correctly completed? Was everything followed constitutionally? And if not, the Supreme Court may issue a ruling that says this no longer can be done, or this was unconstitutional. And that's a way that the Supreme Court has a lot of power. They can kind of change the meaning of the Constitution, even if they don't actually change the wording of the Constitution. If they interpret the Constitution to now say something slightly different than what it used to say, that's kind of the final say on now this is what the Constitution means. There are lots of specific cases of this, and stay tuned in semester 2. We get into a lot of extremely interesting Supreme Court cases that have changed the lives of people in the United States, even without officially amending the wording of the Constitution. So hopefully this overview of the judicial branch has helped. You can watch the other videos in the Unit 5 playlist as well on this channel to learn more about some specific parts of the judicial branch that may be useful for the Unit 5 test and studying for the end of course exam in the future. So if you do have questions, make sure you reach out to your government teacher. Thank you for watching.